I can't hear you though. No.
Now.
Oh.
How about now?
Yes, now. Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
I can hear.
Welcome.
Hello.
I'll face you now. It's very awkward that you're over there and my back in the, yeah, I have to look that way. Yeah. Okay, great. So we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll mute ourselves again until then.
Yeah, yeah, I'll do that.
It's very strange. Hi.
How are you?
Good to see you in person.
Hey, Graeme.
Hey,
How are you?
sure, good to see you.
Yeah, how are you holding up?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, same. Yeah, for sure.
Hey everybody. Hi Maria.
Them to come here.
Okay, cool.
'cause I think
Hey.
Yeah. Also, it is like a hybrid event. I didn't realize that is what it's on Zoom.
Yeah, yeah, it's hybrid. I think a lot of people are going to be in the room.
Yeah. I had somebody guest lecture for me today. What a blessing. I was like, yeah. And somebody speaking up Isabella because Jorge's speaking car is broken again. Let me just send a quick message.
Yeah.
So are they going to show the video that you sent?
I don't know. I think we're on, I think it's recording and we're already being heard in the room, right?
I don't know. Are we?
I think so.
Oh,
I see recording up.
okay.
So when you sit down, they'll be able to see you. So the camera's up there. It's right above the.
Hello, Maria. Hello, Oksana. Can you see me?
Yes,
Hello.
but you're
Hey.
looking away from the camera.
I'm sorry.
You're with your back to the camera.
Oh,
that we
there's the
see.
camera. Oh, I'm looking at you, but you're there.
Yeah.
Hi, now you can see me, right?
Yes.
Okay, this is tricky. So I'll look there. I might look back every so often, and that just means I'm looking at your face on the screen. So just so you know, your faces are projected onto a screen and there's an audience here, and then you'll be able to see the audience that's tuning in on Zoom.
Okay.
Which is growing by the second here. Do you guys have any questions? Do we have any, you guys have any questions before we get started?
No.
Great.
Maybe will I be able to share the screen and show a couple of graphs?
Yes, Maria, you will be
Okay,
able to
perfect.
do that.
Perfect.
Okay. Hi. Hi.
There's a woman here from Carolina Connections,
Okay.
student newspaper thing. She has done interviews, but she's going to capture some audio if you're okay with that.
Yeah,
Because we're
we're
recording,
recording it
And everyone
anyway.
is okay with recording, right?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
Great.
Seeing lots of old students and friends. Good. So you're gonna start. Should we wait a little bit or what do we-
Oh my God, it's my mom's friend Judy.
When you give people the.
This is on. What should- And then when people in here have questions, we'll run them a mic so they can get. No. Okay. All right. Oh, she has one. That mic is on. It should work. Okay. And then. That one will be Milada. And then I'll give this one back to you. They're all three on. Okay, great. Thank you. When you say it like that, Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Hello, everyone on Zoom, especially our special guests. We are really pleased to be doing this event this evening, and I am so grateful for all of our partners. So welcome to Russia's war against Ukraine and Ukraine's challenge to the EU event. Clearly a really important topic, and I'm so glad that we're doing this. I also want to welcome you to Europe Week 2022. The Center for European Studies puts on Europe Week every year in the spring and do a plethora of events over the week. So tonight is day 4, and then tomorrow is our last event. Tomorrow at noon on Zoom, we're going to be talking about the new German coalition, and clearly Ukraine and gas will be playing a large role in tomorrow's event. So zoom in. Tomorrow will only be on Zoom, so zoom in at noon if you can. We'd love to see you there. So tonight we'll be addressing, of course, and discussing the war against Ukraine and the European Union's response, among other things. And the urgency of the situation clearly is growing exponentially. I'm so grateful to all of our speakers for being here to talk with us this evening. And also to all of you, both here in person and on Zoom. This is really geared to be a discussion. We want you to please ask all the questions that you have. It's a concerning situation, and we know you have questions. No question is too small or too complicated or too, just ask what's on your mind, because we want to be discussing the situation and of course what's coming, what can we do. So raise your hand during the Q&A. We'll have a microphone that can go out so that our Zoom speakers and guests can also hear you. And if you're on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat. Our fabulous Kayla over here is monitoring the chat for questions. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Milada Vachudova over here for bringing these wonderful people together on this panel. And I wanted to say that your energy to do something, to organize, to rally is palpable, and it's what we all need right now. So thank you, Milada. Thanks for all you do, not just tonight. I also want to thank all of my colleagues on campus who are holding events on Ukraine, namely, of course, the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, East European Studies. Their director is sitting right next to me. Thank you, Graeme, and Adi, of course, and the whole team, the Russian Flagship Program, the Center for Jewish Studies, the German Slavic Languages and Literatures Department, and many other units on campus. We're all coming at this from various different disciplines, and it's really important to keep the conversation going. So I just want to say thanks. I'm grateful for our community that we have here on this campus every day. And I also just want to mention that Adam Fagan unfortunately can't be with us, both in person or on Zoom, due to a family emergency that happened last minute. So, but we have these 4 other wonderful people that I have the honor of introducing. So I'm going to start with Maria Popova, who is on screen. There she is. She's the Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University in Canada. She's also the scientific co-director of the Jean Monnet Center at Montreal. Her research focuses on the rule of law, judicial reform, political corruption, populist parties, and legal repression of dissidents across the post-communist region. She teaches courses on European politics, comparative judicial policies, and research methods. And she's currently writing a book on the politics of corruption prosecution in Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. You're going to see that you are sitting tonight with the unbelievable experts, really. Next is Oksana Chevelle. She's there, thank you. Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts, the current president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and of the Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Her research projects examine the sources of citizenship policies in the post-communist states, church-state relations in Ukraine, the origins of separatist conflicts in Donbass, and memory politics in post-Soviet Ukraine. She's the author of Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe, which won the 2012 American Association of Ukrainian Studies Book Prize. Her research has appeared in a variety of journals, and I also want to mention that she is the vice president of the Association of the Study of Nationalities, a country expert on Ukraine for Global Citizenship Observatory, and a co-chair of the Post-Communist Politics and Economics Workshop at the Davis Center at Harvard. Milada Vachudova is professor of political science here at UNC. She specializes in European politics, political change in post-communist Europe, the European Union, and the impact of international actors on domestic politics. Her recent articles explore the trajectories of European states amidst strengthening ethnopopulism and democratic backsliding, and how these changes are impacting party systems and the EU. She's also part of the core team of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, or CHESS, on the positions of political parties across Europe. She served as the chair of the Curriculum and Global Studies here at UNC. She's also Jean Monnet Chair for European Studies here at UNC, and her book, Europe Undivided, right, was awarded the Stein-Rokan Prize for comparative social science research. As many of you know, she teaches many courses to our European Studies, Transatlantic Masters and PhD students in European Studies, comparative politics, political science. We're grateful that you're here. Thank you. And last but not least, Graeme Robertson is a professor of political science also here at UNC, director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. His work focuses on political protest and regime support in authoritarian regimes. Your new book with Sam Green here, row 2, is Putin versus the People, clearly very relevant. You're also the author of Revolution and Reform in Ukraine and The Politics of Protest and Hybrid Regimes, Managing Dissident in Post-Communist Russia. You've published articles in many, many journals, and you're also the associate editor for comparative politics, the American Journal of Political Science. So clearly, these folks know what they're talking about, and please, I encourage you to ask all the questions that are on your mind. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. And we are very grateful for the support of the Center for European Studies, as well as the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Affairs for helping us put on this event. Before we get started, I thought we might have just a moment of silence to acknowledge the incredible cruelty and human suffering that has been inflicted on the people of Ukraine by Russia's war against Ukraine. So just a couple of minutes before we dive into the analysis, a couple moments. So we're going to start today with short introductory thoughts by our four speakers. And we're going to start today with Professor Oksana Chevelle, who, as Katie just introduced everyone, from Tufts University. Oksana, take it away.
Thank you very much, Milada, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I will focus just in this few minutes that we have for our opening statements. I'll try to talk about what I think are Putin's goals in Ukraine and how, especially when it comes to Ukrainian identity, what Putin sees and what he wants and what Ukraine wants and what Ukraine is are really incompatible. And I think that affects not only the start of war and its course, but also how war might end. So let me try to talk a little bit more in detail about those goals and the issue of Ukrainian identity and how it is seen very differently and what that really means. I think when we generally, in many analyses of this invasion and sort of why Russia did what it did, we see kind of two narratives or two maybe broader explanations for Russia's actions. And one of the prominent ones, especially among many Western analyses, is that really Russia had some kind of quote unquote legitimate security concerns, and more especially that it didn't want NATO to expand to its borders, and including Ukraine and NATO was a really red line. And that's essentially where what led to the war. I mean, this is the narrative we see from Russian officials themselves. I don't know if any of you saw even today, I think Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, gave an interview to Sky News Network, and he talked about how Ukraine becoming a member of NATO and then trying to return Crimea and then, basically activating Article 5 and NATO countries would come to defend Ukraine with the nukes, and that would be the start of the Third World War. And essentially Russia's attack on Ukraine was to prevent this, right? So that was kind of the justification that Russia had legitimate security concerns. And I think many in the West have been quite quick to admit to that, and because, not only, countries do have legitimate security concerns, but it also makes such settlement sort of seem like reasonable, right? So it's not unreasonable to have security concerns, and maybe then, Putin is a rational actor, and we can reason with him and give him, say, some kind of concession along those lines, and that would be sort of the end of that. And I wouldn't say, of course, that Russia didn't have fears of NATO and concerns about NATO, but I think what really has been driving Putin's war in Ukraine is his imperial ambitions towards Ukraine, denial of Ukrainian identity, legitimacy of the Ukrainian state, and that is really informed by Russia's image as a great power and what its proper, quote unquote, natural borders ought to include. And these borders need to include control of Ukraine, maybe not outright absorption of Ukraine into Russia, but certainly, the kind of political control over that territory that is central to Russia's image of itself as a great power. Without control of Ukraine, basically this project of Greater Russia or civilization of a proper Russia, as Putin sees it, is impossible. And I think we should take Putin's sort of thinking about this seriously. It seems, I think, again, some maybe, and we do see this in some Western analyses, that it is somehow kind of fluff. It's maybe more of the rhetoric, that yes, he says that, but maybe it's more for domestic audience. It's not really kind of, that's not what really drives the ultimate actions, right, and the goals of Russia. I don't think that's the case. I think we should take Putin's obsession with history very seriously. We have various evidence, not only him reading, being very engaged, in historical, what he considers analyses, writing this long historical treatise, lecturing Macron for hours on end about history, right, as opposed to sort of concrete security concerns. So I think that's very important. Now, so if we think about sort of what exactly that narrative is about Ukraine and what is acceptable and not acceptable to Russia, we basically, have the situation where any kind of Ukrainian real legitimate sovereignty as a sovereign nation that is able to decide its own affairs domestically, and I'm not just talking here about foreign policy alliance, because I think actually it wouldn't be enough if there is an agreement that say Ukraine would not join NATO, and that would end the war and lead to peaceful settlement. I would argue that that's not likely, exactly because Putin's objectives vis-a-vis Ukraine are much more sinister and more broader. So this long-standing narrative of this unity of the three Slavic peoples, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, right, how the Kievan Rus is really the origins of the Russian state, and Ukrainians are essentially at best sort of a younger brother, they're not a real nation. Putin had said that on many occasions. I think that's very important to realize. This narrative was always there. The sentiment is pretty deeply held. It maybe not always drove Russian foreign policy of every act with regard to Ukraine. And there are also some reasons for it, because if you think about as much of a shock as the collapse of the Soviet Union was in 1991, as Putin defined the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, it didn't, for good, we can say, eliminated this prospect of Russia somehow regaining control or dominance in Ukraine. Russia preserved many levers of influence over Ukrainian politics. Ukraine had substantial pro-Russian or Russia-friendly electorate in the south and the east of the country. Presidents in Ukraine kind of alternated between more pro-Russian, pro-Western. So yes, as much as sort of 91 was a problem, it didn't seem, or at least it could be perceived as not dealing really a death blow to this prospect of eventual some form of unification, political unification, Russia's control over these territories through, many different political arrangements that were tried in this space since 1991. What I think was the turning point, certainly the way that Russia saw it, was 2014, when pro-Russian President Yanukovych was driven out of power in Ukraine. And again, Yanukovych was not trying to join NATO. He was in the process of signing association and free trade agreement with the EU. And that was for Russia already a red line. I think it's also very important to realize that NATO was nowhere in the picture. In 2014, there was little political support within Ukraine for joining NATO. There was never more than 25% at most of the population in favor. But this, Ukraine signing a free trade agreement with the EU, which basically meant that it was not going to participate in this political economic structures dominated by Russia that were seen as an alternative, was really the red line. That in Russia was perceived as the point after which Ukraine may slip away for good. Again, we can debate whether it actually would have happened. I personally don't think it would have happened. I think had Russia not done what it did in 2014 with annexing Crimea, starting Donbass insurgency, it could have actually kept quite a lot of influence over Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine was going to join NATO, but that doesn't matter what I think. I think it's pretty clear that that's how it was perceived in Russia. So the narrative became that Ukraine is now this sort of anti-Russian center, occupied essentially de facto by the West, and was everything that was occurring in Ukraine was aimed against Russia. This is, again, almost verbatim what Peskov has been saying in today's interview, and there are different versions of it in the Putin's narrative as well, right? So here we have, I think, great kind of mismatch between Russia's perception of Ukraine as not being quote unquote a real nation, therefore not really entitled or even sort of objectively possible for real Ukrainians to have any kind of anti-Russian sentiment. The dismissal of public opinion since 2014 in particular that took substantial turn and became much less pro-Russian in different regions of Ukraine, including in the south and the east historically, that were more pro-Russian after Crimea was annexed and the separatist war started in Donbass. We see really substantial change in Ukrainian public opinion that Putin repeatedly dismissed. So these preferences were not real. They were either a result of some sort of Western meddling, or people were afraid to express express their true pro-Russian preferences as Putin saw it. And I think this is exactly what we see, that the war was informed by this misperception of Ukrainian identity, that the country would agree to be liberated once they're no longer oppressed by these quote unquote Nazi nationalists, right? So people at the core, at heart, like the real Ukrainians were pro-Russian, and they would welcome the liberators once they rolled in their tanks. Now, since that didn't happen, I think, again, we probably have time later to talk about misperceptions and how it affected the course of the war. But clearly, Russian troops are not greeted as liberators anywhere in Ukraine, including, again, in the historically much more pro-Russian east and south of the country. So then, and now what we see that this imperial kind of intent towards Ukraine turns out right genocidal with events that we saw in Bucha, and we can only imagine what's happening in other places where Russian forces have been, occupying the territory in Mariupol and elsewhere. We don't even know the extent of this. But what is really scary, so this narrative of denazification really, I think, captures, and it's very important to acknowledge, Putin's true goals about Ukraine. Again, it's not about just NATO membership, and we see that in the negotiation. They're talking about some sort of arrangement where Ukraine would agree not to join NATO, which, by the way, Ukrainian leadership is willing to give up in return for security guarantees. But it comes in part and parcel of demands for so-called demilitarization and denazification. So what does it really mean? Let me just say a few words about that, and I'll end there. So demilitarization essentially means that the country would be left defenseless and unable to withstand any further Russian attack. So it's not just about not being a member of NATO, but it's about not having a functioning army. They're talking about no more than 50,000 troops, no foreign training, sort of great limitations of Ukraine's capacity to defend itself, which essentially means that, again, that would be constant threat of further Russian invasion. The country would not be able to defend itself, so it would have no choice but to submit to Russia. I think that's the overall logic of demilitarization. Again, not just about NATO. Denazification is even more sinister, because denazification does not just involve the so-called nationalist battalions, right? That people like Azov and some radical nationalists would somehow be taken out of Ukrainian political process. It extends to essentially any sphere of domestic politics that would promote some idea of separate Ukraine or Ukrainian identity that Russia finds unacceptable. They talk about education. We see reports of removal of textbooks, even school teachers being executed in the occupied territories. The information space, where Russia insists that Russian propaganda channels have to be allowed, again, under the guise of sort of freedom of press, which is kind of ironic since there is no freedom of press in Russia, right? But essentially, the ideological narrative would have to be controlled by Russia within Ukraine in the information space. Ban on all expressions of what they call nationalist opinions, which extends to anything. It extends to memory politics, it extends to education. So again, any kind of interpretation of history, education, literature, you name it, that is, again, perceived as supporting this idea of separate Ukraine is out of the question. Russian language, again, de-Ukrainianization, not using Ukrainian language, elevation of Russian language. So essentially, again, this process of blurring and eventually eliminating the boundaries between, separate Ukrainian and Russian nations. So, and that, again, it comes part and parcel of this negotiation, which is, yes, they do want Ukraine to agree not to be part of NATO, but also to also pursue these kinds of policies. So needless to say, these demands are not acceptable to the Ukrainian government. The government may concede some arrangement with regard to Crimea and the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the borders that they existed before February 2014, but not succession of any further territory or voluntary denazification and de-Russification and all of these things that Russia seeks. And I think some in the West who call for appeasing Russia and giving it some sort of off-ramp, right, when it can claim partial victory, which essentially would mean that, say, Russia would be allowed to occupy additional territory, I think should be very clear-eyed what that would mean for the people on these territories. These kinds of genocidal policies of systematic extermination of any pro-Ukrainian element in the society, from activists to local officials to journalists, military, police, teachers. Basically, that's what we see. This is exactly what's going to happen on this territory. So I don't see, honestly, how rewarding this war of aggression with territorial concessions that would allow the aggressive state to commit genocidal acts would either serve peace in Ukraine or peace globally. So I think really the only possibility here, and this is why I'm going to end here, I think there is really no middle ground here for victory, for peace, right? It would either have to be that Russia essentially gets its way, originally maybe towards part of Ukraine that it gets to occupy and pursue its genocidal policies there. And ultimately it would extend further on, because as long as independent sovereign state of Ukraine exists, even if it exists in smaller borders, the same concerns Russia has would remain. So there will be no peace in the medium or long term. Or I think the other possibility would be that Russia would have to be militarily defeated, or at least forced to negotiate from the position of weakness when it becomes clear that it actually cannot occupy and control the territory in Ukraine. And I think this is why military assistance for Ukraine is critical in order to enable Ukraine to push Russia back. And I'll end here because, of course, there are further implications and potential questions what it would mean, for Russian state and so forth. But I'm not going to go into that. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, that's. We will circle back to this question of what the West is doing and what more the West should be doing, because that is really essential at this very moment where I think you're absolutely right. There's a moment where we could be looking at a very long war or a very terrible outcome for Ukraine, or we could see an actual sort of humiliation and defeat by Russia. There are two things that you brought up that I think really stay with me. One is the irony that it's literally on Putin's watch that Putin himself, through his own policies, sort of lost Ukraine or alienated Ukraine so profoundly, right? You had a country that was not so decidedly in the West or against Russia. And so if Putin's goal had ever been a kind of warm embrace of this country, he's done everything to have exactly the opposite outcome. And that's also true for NATO, right? This, as you mentioned, the very high favorability now for joining NATO, but also NATO coming right up to Russian borders now and the reinforcement of NATO in the East. Let's turn now to Professor Maria Popova. Maria, go ahead, and then we'll circle back with questions in a bit.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So what I wanted to talk about today briefly is two main points. The first one is about Ukraine's EU prospects. As you all know, at the very beginning of the war, President Zelensky asked the EU to give Ukraine expedited membership into the EU. And, the EU didn't go for a quick solution, which is, really shocking. But they're studying this question right now. They're deciding what to do. And while I won't actually give suggestions as to how the EU can figure this out and what kind of roadmap it has to offer, what I wanted to emphasize is that Ukraine is actually more ready for EU membership than a lot of people realize. And I won't go into all the details of the different ways in which Ukraine is ready, but I'll mention that over the last 8 years, Ukraine has done a lot of progress in terms of controlling corruption, in terms of strengthening the state by implementing decentralization reforms that gave power to municipal governments, and today we see that municipal governments and local governments are working hard to defend Ukraine in this war. So partly and also enjoy legitimacy and trust by the local population. That is partly a result, of course, of this decentralization campaign. We also see, of course, the further unification of the Ukrainian nation under this attack, which means that the previous regionalism that characterized Ukrainian politics is a thing of the past, and what we expect to see come out of this is sort of realignment of the party system in Ukraine along more traditional East-West traditional left-right cleavage rather than a pro-Western, pro-Russian cleavage, which characterized the Ukrainian party system in the earlier period. And what I wanted to emphasize today is the progress that Ukraine has made in terms of building both the institutions, but also shifting practices in terms of rule of law. And why do I emphasize this? Not only because that's the part that I have worked on for years, but also because, as you all know, rule of law issues have been traditionally sort of the main stumbling block that new members of the EU have faced in the process of integration within the EU. Sort of concerns about the independence of the courts, about politicians' sort of designs on how to control the courts, concerns about judicial corruption. These are all issues that all the newer member states of the EU have faced since joining in the mid-2000s. And Ukraine has actually done more progress on this than we appreciate. And the progress started in 2014 when a lot of new judicial institutions, judicial reforms were adopted. There were constitutional amendments. There were 8 different laws that were adopted under Poroshenko's administration. Some things moved in the right direction, but there wasn't enough progress. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we saw Poroshenko defeated in his re-election bid in 2019. And one of the promises of the Zelensky administration to move judicial reform even faster. Now, under Zelensky, things didn't dramatically improve overnight. In fact, things were not going as quickly as civil society activists promoting judicial reform wanted things to go, but they moved in the right direction. And we saw the establishment of an anti-corruption court with active participation of Ukrainian civil society and European partners in monitoring who actually gets appointed to this court. There was serious vetting by an ethics council to make sure that the right people are appointed to this court. The ethics council was very active in also reforming the High Council of the Judiciary, which is an institution that is usually at the crux of rule of law problems in post-communist EU members. Usually the Supreme Council of the Judiciary, Supreme Judicial Council, is an institution where entrenched judicial elites used their influence on the judiciary and at the same time colluded with politicians to continue to deliver politically useful decisions to incumbent and powerful opposition politicians as well. And in Ukraine, actually in the run-up to this war, there was significant progress done towards dislodging these judicial elites. And in fact, in the month right before the war started, a lot of these, actually a critical number of members of the Supreme Judicial Council resigned because they refused to face the ethics scrutiny by the Ethics Council. So this would have been really a breakthrough. And what I wanted to show you is a couple of graphs from VDEM data that illustrate the amount of progress. And if you see here, I want to start with judicial accountability. So what this measures is the respondents who say that in Ukraine, in different countries, the judiciary is likely to be held accountable for things like judicial corruption and misuse of judicial office. And what we see here on this graph, Ukraine is the orange line, and you see very significant progress since 2014. All these reforms are really making a difference, and we see that Ukraine is now doing better than some of the Eastern European EU members. If you look at judicial, at the independence of the high court, also VDEM data. Oh, there it is. I hope that's the right slide. Does it say high court judicial independence?
We haven't changed slides yet here.
Oh.
Maybe unshare your screen and then share it again.
How about now? It doesn't do it?
No.
Okay, never mind. I don't want to take more time. I don't want to take more time with this because I think I'm running out of time anyway. Did that work?
Yes, it did.
Okay, so we see an improvement there, and as some of the EU members that have struggled very much with high court judicial independence, like Poland and Hungary, have gone down in this over time, Ukraine is going up. But I also wanted to illustrate this change with the example of former President Poroshenko, who had been indicted and is still actually being under those charges for treason, serious charges against him, and compare the reaction and sort of compare the behavior of former President Poroshenko to what we observed when Yanukovych was prosecuting his political opponents in the 2010s, Tymoshenko, Lutsenko, actually several other ministers. And what you observed then was sort of an assumption from the very start that when charges were brought against these politicians, that they will of course be convicted by the Ukrainian judiciary. There was not a lot of doubt that Tymoshenko was headed to jail, and some of the politicians charged as a result left the country to avoid charges because they did not expect an independent process. Poroshenko, on the other hand, 10 years later, returned to Ukraine to face those charges, was defiant, sounded like any other European politician charged with malfeasance of some kind. He said he was going to beat those charges. He was going to challenge Zelensky in the next election. In other words, he tried to use those charges to sort of draw political benefit from it. And the point here is that this is only possible if you expect some degree of judicial independence. Otherwise, this behavior doesn't really make sense. And indeed, Poroshenko is still in Kiev and now very much supporting and rallying behind his former political opponent, Zelensky. I think I'm out of time, right? I might actually stop here and make some of the other points I had in our discussion.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. We will circle back for a number of other points. I can't help but sort of say it's great the way President Zelensky was able to say to NATO, you know, don't ever talk to me anymore about whether Ukraine is good enough militarily to join NATO. Let's just talk about whether NATO is good enough to join Ukraine. But looking at your charts there, I think maybe what we need after the elections in Hungary last weekend is that Hungary takes a little pause on EU membership and we bring Ukraine on in. Because clearly, in Hungary now we have in many ways, an authoritarian regime with no prospect of any of those lines going up in the near future. Whereas in Ukraine, you see this kind of vibrant, contentious politics that leads to improvement. And also, as you said, and I've been so impressed with local government in Ukraine in the face of this war. The state administration, state capacity, things like the railroads, the utilities, right now trying to put internet back into places like Bucha and Irpin. So we really see the consequences of the decentralization and the strengthening of local government capacity, and also the people's kind of recognition of those local governments and regional governments as serving their needs, which I think is really impressive. Let me turn it to you, Professor Robertson.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel, especially with real Ukraine experts like Maria and Oksana. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ukraine. I've done some research there over the last 10 years. I've done a lot more research in Russia, so I'll say a little bit more about Russia. But I wanted to sort of broaden out the point that Maria was making about the role of Ukraine itself building its own nation and conducting going the hard yards, the difficult trip that it takes to make these reforms. I don't want to give Putin the credit for building Ukraine as a civic state. What Ukrainians have done it themselves. What's been amazing, Ukraine has a civil society that's like no other that I've seen around the world at this level of economic development. And when the Euromaidan revolution happened in 2014, Ukraine emerged out of this already with a civil society that had detailed plans for what reforms were needed and how those reforms would be implemented. Now, they had to overcome lots of political opposition in the parliament, and a lot of these corrupt forces were still around after the revolution. And so it was, having a plan was not enough. They had to actually make it happen. But the progress in that is progress that belongs to the Ukrainian people. And it's been absolutely amazing. And it's, it's seen in the indicators that we saw from Maria, but all across all sorts of different sectors. Civil society in Ukraine played a role. We sort of, I thought of it with some co-authors as we think of it as a sandwich model, where international donors, when they're giving money to a country, have a really hard time monitoring what's actually going on in the country. And they're pretty easily faked out by sophisticated actors on the ground. This was not a problem in Ukraine because Ukraine had its own highly sophisticated, highly mobilized civil society who could actually do the kind of vetting that Maria was talking about, and could really monitor each law in detail and find the tricky codicil 4.76H that actually nullifies the rest of all of the stuff, and then call up Brussels and have an open dialogue with Brussels to say, listen, you can't give them visa-free travel to the EU until this legislation gets fixed. And it's happened over and over and over. And it's really a tribute to Ukraine's amazing civil society. I also, on thinking about the Russian side of this tragedy, this invasion, this horror, I totally agree with Oksana's analysis of the real underlying reasons for the war. If Russia had a security problem, this was the single worst way to go about addressing it. And Russia now really does have a security problem if it didn't have one before. And so I think that explanation for why people actually acted the way they did is totally empty. This is an imperial war. I would go a little further than that too, though, and put this in the context of how Putin has legitimized his role in Russia over the last 20 years. The first decade, roughly, or so, of Putin's time in office was basically his legitimacy and his popularity was based on economic development, neoliberal reforms, but primarily extremely high oil prices. That whole thing came to an end with the global financial crisis in 2009. And then with the economic, with the political model of state, of a state riddled and eaten away by the personal interests of Putin and his entourage, by the personal interests of senior members of the security forces, and the incredibly weak property rights that that system requires for its survival. That's just incompatible with economic growth through anything other than just the high price of oil. And so Putin doesn't have an alternative where he can go back to the previous version of his regime. And instead, what he's done is he's doubled down on opposition to the West, on Russia as being a vulnerable, besieged fortress is the term that they often use. And that conflict with the West, that war with the West, including Ukraine, central, front and center of that, is as essential to Putin's role today as anything else. And so that will, while Putin's in power, that will not go away. And it's not incidental to the system of power in Russia. It's central, I think, to the way Russian politics works today. Finally, just there's a kind of I've heard it described as a fantasy, a liberal fantasy, that the disaster that Putin has inflicted upon Ukraine and upon Russia will turn out to be an overreach, right? And he'll end up getting overthrown in a coup, and somehow something good will come out of all this horror. I think it is highly unlikely. Not sure I would go as far as to say it's a fantasy, but I think it is highly unlikely, and we could talk about why that would be. But I do think that the emphasis that people put on opinion polls taken in a state that is now ruling by fear and by repression is excessive. To say that the Russian people support this war, I think you just can't tell that from the opinion polls that we see. What I do know is that polling that we did before and the war, and polling that others did before the war, indicates there was no appetite for this in Russia. Last summer, we conducted polls on so-called lost territories. So we asked people in Russia how much they thought about Ukraine and how important getting those territories back were. How important was it to use military pressure on Ukraine to return territories? We asked the same questions in Romania and Hungary and in Germany. And what we found was that the Russians were much less exercised about this issue than Romanians and Hungarians. Germans even less so, thank goodness. But there was just no appetite for this within Russia. Polling done back in December by the Russian Election Survey showed that 80% of even the Communist Party voters, even the LDPR, the so-called Nationalist Party voters, even United Russia, were opposed to the use of military force in Ukraine. So there was no appetite for this. And I think that makes us really take a step back and ask ourselves how to interpret these polls. If you look at activity on Vkontakte, you'll see that despite it being punishable by up to 15 years in jail, people use the word war very frequently to describe what's going on in Ukraine. There are lots of voices that are highly critical of the situation, people openly, identifiable individuals. So I think while an uprising to overthrow Putin tomorrow is not going to happen, I think you would misunderstand the situation in Russia to think that Russians are behind this war in any meaningful way. At least as a majority, there certainly are forces in Russia that are well behind this war, but I think you have to take a nuanced view of Russian society.
I think for my brief remarks before I ask the panelists a couple of questions and then open it up to you, I think I want to start from a place of urgency, because I feel that we could settle into a long war and a long habit of analyzing what's happening on the ground in the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions and Western military aid, and find ourselves months down the line looking back and wondering kind of why we missed a critical juncture where there's at least the possibility of intervening or taking steps even more decisively that could bring about another Russian defeat. So we've had a Russian defeat north of Kyiv, Russian forces have been, fought. The Ukrainian military has fought very well. The Russian military has fought very poorly, and the Russian troops have withdrawn and taken very, very heavy casualties. Can we expect such a thing in the East? It's going to be much, much more difficult. But I think what the West does now really has to come from a reading of what's happening on the ground. So on the Ukrainian side, we've talked about this. You have a flawed but vibrant liberal democracy fighting for its very existence. We have never seen, I think, well, I won't say never, but such a clear case, right, of a country. The Ukrainian military has never left the borders of the Ukrainian state. This is entirely being fought by Russian military on the lands of Ukraine. And this actually has a lot of bearings, for example, on war crimes, because it is only Russian military that even has access to civilians that there are no Russian civilians that are in the line of fire. There's also the question then, what is happening in terms of Russian goals, Russian intent? Oksana talked about that quite a bit. It's really distressing, I think, for all of us, thinking about what happened in Bucha, what's happened in Irpin, what's happening in Mariupol, and we don't even know the extent of the horrible war crimes against civilian populations, but they're coming out in like heartbreaking ways, like blogs by teenagers and poems written by young children, and just incredible suffering. And now we're faced with the discussion of whether what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is genocide. And there's clear evidence that it looks like genocide, at least when you look at some of the documents that have been published, where essentially the Russian state is saying our intention is to eliminate the Ukrainian nation, which should never have existed in the first place. So I think when we look back at this point in time, some 45 days into the war, after Bucha, knowing that what we find in Mariupol and elsewhere is going to be even worse, how has the West responded? And, if you could say, it's incredible how the West has responded. Some of the things that have happened in the last 6 weeks, no one thought would ever happen. Germany is sending weapons, not the best weapons, not as all that many, but sending them. Nord Stream 2 has been canceled. You have this large coalition of Western democracies and other states that have put in place very extensive sanctions. But you could also look at it from the other side and say, so far, these sanctions have been regulated or moderated in such a way that they don't really inflict any economic pain on the domestic populations of the countries that are imposing the sanctions. Germany is at a crossroads right now, right? Because it has agreed to a lot of sanctions, but has not agreed to a sudden end to purchasing Russian energy. Now, if it did do that suddenly, it would be painful for the German economy, for German citizens. And it's at a kind of crossroads because so much of the energy that Germany consumes is from Russia. So to give you just a statistic, the aid that Ukraine has been given over the last 40 days or so amounts to about $1 billion, which is a lot. But the EU has spent $35 billion in that period of time purchasing energy from Russia. So Russian oil and gas, as well as some coal. So I think you can say that at this very moment, there is still so much more that could be done, both in terms of what the Western coalition countries, the United States, the EU, NATO countries themselves can do in terms of economic sanctions. And there are also states that have not joined the sanctions, such as Israel, India, Brazil, China. So some of those states will never join the sanctions, but others perhaps could be persuaded to do more. And then the last is military help. This is one of those places where I feel like we've spent so much time telling Putin what we're not going to do, that it's really given him a free hand. We keep telling him we're not going to go in with ground troops, we're not going to provide any kind of no-fly zone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of concern about nuclear war and is he stable and whatnot. But that line that we draw in terms of giving weapons to Ukraine often seems like a line that we draw in our heads. You know, why can we send unlimited number of anti-tank weapons? I think Secretary Blinken said today that for every Russian tank, we're sending 10 anti-tank weapons, you know, the kind that they hold, like the NLAWs and the Javelins, but we can't find a way to get a few fighter jets to Ukraine. So I think we're at a very critical moment where the West has been really moderating what it does and thinking more about its own repercussions for itself and then thinking about how to actually end this war quickly. And the final thing I want to say is that, you know, we were wrong. We were wrong. And I think in terms, specifically, we were wrong, I think, about the relationship between Russia and the West. And that is especially important when it comes to energy. I've been teaching this European security class for 15 years. And for so many students, I've given presentations about, well, gosh, Germany and other EU countries sure buy a lot of energy from Russia, but it's sort of like mutually assured destruction, right? That even though this potentially gives a lot of leverage to Putin because Europe has become dependent on Russian energy, it's also the case that Russia is dependent on being able to sell that energy to the West. And so that should mean that everyone sort of behaves themselves. Well, that's not how it's turned out, right? It has not turned out that this sale of energy to the West has really given us leverage to stop Putin from exercising this war, from prosecuting this war with incredible casualties. So either we need to kind of rewrite all of our international relations theories and the way we think about mutual dependence and bargaining, or we need to think about actually exercising that leverage and what that would mean in terms of cutting off those 35 billion and counting that are going to the Russian state. Okay, I want to start by just one question from me, and then we'll open up. And just in this vein, briefly, like what else should the West be doing right now? So when you think about, and I'll start with Oksana, when you think about what needs to be done right now, what's most urgent, what do you think about?
Yeah, thank you, Milada. I basically would echo what you were saying about the more, more serious types of weapons and faster, right? Because it is indeed also a puzzle to me, like why, for example, shipping javelins and all these other types of weapons over the border is not quote unquote escalation, right? But if you have an old MiG that Ukrainian pilot can fly across the border, that somehow would lead to nuclear war. I think that argument has no leg to stand on. And also, I mean, I think when we think about weapons, we should also think of humanitarian consequences of not sending weapons, right? Because Russia is basically shelling indiscriminately Ukrainian residential areas. If Ukraine had longer range missiles, right? Like if it had air defense systems that could save countless lives. So if indeed the West, and this actually the argument one of the Ukrainian officials made recently, I mean, we don't have to agree with it, but he is basically saying that the reason the West has been cautious with these weapons, because the West prefers not outright defeat of Russia, but sort of this long exhaustion of Russia, right? Now, I don't know, like whoever strategizes in the West, I think, I wouldn't agree with this logic, but I think, weapons basically also have humanitarian consequences. And as ironic as it may seem, the way to end refugee crisis, the way to end the civilians is actually to send more weapons to Ukraine that it can actually, dominate on the battlefield sooner rather than later. And another thing I would mention again, Milada, something echoing that you said, I think, this idea that, yes, the West has done a lot, as you said, certain things that were completely off the table before, now they have happened, Germany's policy change, so forth, right? But as you said, right, the West seems to still be, especially Europe, like unwilling to absorb some economic pain, right, for this war to end. And for Ukraine to regain its sovereignty. And I mean, this is really, I think, fundamentally an issue, right? Like if the West defends these values, would 2% inflation in Germany is too high a price to pay for this, right? Like, is this really what it's about? And somewhat ironically, it seems like the societies in Western countries are actually willing to bear these costs, right? We see that from the opinion polls, we see that from demonstrations, and yet the politicians are not. So I think this will be some also reckoning for West European nations as to sort of what they really stand for and what kind of sacrifice, if any, they're willing to make.
And we are seeing growing mobilization. For example, in Berlin, I think there's a protest every day now calling for the German government to stop buying Russian energy. So, we're seeing that contention within West European countries. Italy has come out quite favorable to an EU ban on Russian energy sales. Maria.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the question of energy. I think that a lot more needs to be done. The West could be doing a lot more in that regard. Not just thinking about banning Russian energy in Europe. I mean, the Baltic states have already moved towards that. The rest of Europe needs to do it too. And I think what the sort of central issue here is not only the question of what the economic price of that will be for local publics. I think there's something even deeper than that, which is this, what is going to be the relationship between Europe and Russia in the long term? And I think this is the reluctance to ban energy is partially due, partly it's about short-term economic effects from it, but partly it's due to this idea that, this war will end and some sort of cooperation between Europe and Russia will resume. So we're trying to, influence Russia now, but eventually we will be going back to buying oil from them because we will resume cooperation. And I think what the West really needs to do more of right now is to think, do we want to resume cooperation with Russia? Or do we want to actually isolate Russia right now through these economic sanctions, but also think in the long run? Do we want Western companies to be weathering this storm and then go back to doing business in Russia? So I think there is some more fundamental rethinking here to be done in order to decide what to do. And another avenue that I'll throw out here, there was an op-ed in the LA Times written by someone from MIT studying law, I think, that proposes that right now what we should be doing is filing private lawsuits in the West and seizing assets connected to the Russian energy trade. And that is actually tied to this idea of what do we want as a longer term relationship with Russia. I mean, do we, because the private lawsuits, one of the concerns there is if we start, seizing assets, maybe it undermines, property rights in the long term. Well, maybe that's something to be considered right now, that longer term relationship between Russia and the rest of the, and the West that cares about rule of law has to be reevaluated.
Yeah, and this is not a new argument, right? Because Nord Stream 2, which the U.S. government was against, so many voices were advising Germany to not go through with Nord Stream 2, and there was this real kind of dedication on the part of the German elite to this is just an economic project. This is just an economic project. And, we see so clearly that this is not an economic project. This is very much a geopolitical project to enmesh and intertwine yourself with the Russian state. Graeme, what would you like to add?
Well, just a couple of things. One is, I'm sure you are aware of the UN climate report that came out this week that says that we can't have a long term. There is no long term, right, with fossil fuels. And in fact, we have to act immediately. And so this seems to me to be an opportunity to really get serious about this issue and cut ourselves off from Russian fossil fuels. We have to do it anyway. Let's do it now. And then the second thing I would say is that go back to something that Oksana said about there being no obvious kind of short to medium term negotiated solution to this war. that either Russia is going to win or Russia has to be defeated. And I think that's absolutely correct. And I think, Russia has to be defeated. And to do that, we then need to, work with the Ukrainians to find out what they need to make that happen. And that's the conversations that should be going on. And that should be our goal and our strategy.
Yeah, the foreign minister this morning at the NATO summit said, I have 3 agenda items: weapons, weapons, and weapons. Although he did have a 4th, which was more sanctions. So let's open it up to questions. And if your question is to a specific speaker, let us know. Otherwise, ask your questions. The mic is coming around. Are you mic? Okay, Katie's the mic person. I see Hannah's hand up there. Way up there. Oh, sorry.
Is this working? So I just had a question for Oksana and Maria, because I read your article on why Putin's war is not about NATO. And one of the things I found really interesting that you were talking about is that the concern was more about political competition being at Russia's doorstep, because that would threaten authoritarianism. And so I was just wondering if you guys had more thoughts to explain that, and if you think then that would mean that Russia would have to, be in a position of weakness to accept that political competition is going to exist in Ukraine and will continue to exist with that democracy.
Well, I'll start. I still think that's an argument that holds, right? Meaning that I think Ukraine, among other things, was dangerous for Putin exactly as a precedent of a functioning democracy in a country that is, in many ways similar to Russia, and sort of what precedent it could set for the Russian society. But I almost want to say, given sort of what has been happening since the war and the turn the rhetoric took, this really genocidal, not just some sort of general claim that Ukrainians are not a real nation, but kind of sustained action, actionable plans that have been published in the Russian state-controlled media of how to eliminate Ukraine. I think we are sort of almost moved past that. Like, yes, I think threat for democracy in Ukraine is a threat to Russia, but it now seems like they really decided that the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign state is a threat. So I would add that, maybe it's something we didn't maybe that much emphasized in that particular article, which I think is now very clear.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think at the time, it seemed like the big threat is, and over the last 8 years, it seems that was or even since the Orange Revolution, that was a major threat, but they have definitely moved past it. Yeah, I'll stop.
And it's interesting, right? Because that's premised on the idea that Putin might lose power if he had a civic uprising, sort of civil mobilization in Russia, something like Euromaidan or the Orange Revolution. But right now we don't really know. Graeme is shaking his head. Thank you, Hannah. Are there questions? Ashley, go ahead. Actually, Hannah, she's right in front of you. There you go.
So I found it interesting that Milada, you mentioned, this is approximating, or people are saying that this is a genocide, and how kind of extraordinary the response would be, or perhaps the non-response to this is. But my question is it that extraordinary in the context of a world in which there are, multiple human rights violations at any given time, that we've ignored, the reduction of autonomy in Kashmir, we're ignoring the Tigray genocide in Ethiopia? Like, isn't this just par for the course? And why are the stakes in Ukraine so high, given that there are, reductions or attacks on free democracies, perhaps world round? Why is this the thing that we need to be focused on, and that the West has to intervene in? Like, why is this the linchpin for us at this particular moment?
So I think that's a great question. I will say a couple of things, and then I'll let others jump in. I think for starters, we have the invasion of a very powerful state in the international system invading its liberal, democratic, weaker neighbor. So a real kind of David and Goliath story, yes, but also the fact that, Ukraine wasn't doing anything. This wasn't a war over territory or a long-standing disputed. This is basically a wholesale invasion of a peaceful democratic state. And this kind of a wholesale invasion of a peaceful democratic state is shocking. Of course, civil war is also shocking, but I think that that is powerful. It's happening at the doorstep of Europe. Geography matters. Whether this is, whether it should matter as much as it seems to matter, it's certainly the case that this is at the doorstep of the European Union and at the doorstep of NATO. And I think Hannah's question is also important because at the core of it, right, is not just the whole concept of sovereignty, which has been completely violated in this case, but also a regime question, right, where an authoritarian, totalitarian state is trying to extinguish a state which is building an imperfect but beautiful liberal democracy. So all of those things together. But Oksana, Maria, anything you'd like to add?
My thoughts were along the same line as yours, Milada, that the shocking part here is that you have a country that's supposed to be, a guarantor of the post-World War II norm of territorial inviolability, making a complete mockery of it. It blows up. It's more than a war with a horrible humanitarian toll. It really kind of blows up the whole international order because of who the perpetrator of this war is.
Graeme, anything you'd like?
Yeah, just one thing that to add on this, just from my own sort of recent experience, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we started to organize efforts to help scholars under threat in Ukraine. And one of the first sort of messages I got when we started that effort was, well, we didn't do anything in Afghanistan, so why should we do something in Ukraine? Which I found to be staggering, right? I thought, isn't it the other way around? Shouldn't we use the opportunity of the engagement and the public engagement around Ukraine to also do something for scholars from Afghanistan, and then maybe institutionalize a process whereby we do things for scholars at risk? And that's just in our little academic lane. But I think it's not a reason for inaction that bad things happen in other places. That's kind of reminds me of a sort of Putin-style whataboutery, right? It's, oh well, you did something bad too, so we just let it slide. I don't think that's the right way to think about it.
Other questions? I saw some hands. Over here. Oh, go ahead and give it to whoever had there, and then Kat is going to be next over here.
Good evening. I've been struck by just how effective Russian state disinformation has been in swaying public opinion inside Russia. And I understand that given it's a state organ that does that, and they've kind of eliminated the free press inside Russia. But I've been reading recently that the Russian Orthodox Church is also a player in this. And promoting pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian disinformation campaigns. And I didn't know if you had a sense on how big a player they are in that and what the history of the Russian Orthodox Church is in supporting Putin and his regime.
Why don't you take that for starters? And
Sure. So I'm not really an expert on the Russian Orthodox Church, but it is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the Russian state. And has been historically. There is no separation of church and state in Russia, and the Russian Orthodox Church has taken its marching orders from the Kremlin, before Putin, during the Soviet period, and before that. So I'm not at all surprised to find that that's the situation. In terms of the effectiveness of Russian disinformation, I think this is actually a really interesting question, because so many of the claims that come out of the Kremlin are self-evidently ridiculous, and they are also so varied, right? So today, Peskov is talking about security issues. Well, they haven't really talked about that very much before, but they've talked about nuclear weapons, they've talked about chemical weapons, they've talked about genocide, they've talked about discrimination in some vague sense, they've talked about denazification, they've talked about all of this different stuff. And I ask myself often, like, why? Why so many different justifications? Why are they throwing so much stuff at the wall to see what sticks, right? And we had a really interesting talk 2 weeks ago, I think it was. Gulnaz Sharafudinova from King's College in London was here. And one of the things that she was saying is that in her interactions with her family, which she back in Russia, what she's found is that all of these different justifications are out there to give people a menu of options for when they kind of feel under pressure to recognize what's going on. They have a range of different layers of protection that they can have in front of themselves. So they don't have to buy one lie or any particular lie, but there's a range of options around there that they can rely on. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I just find it to be incredibly interesting and potentially researchable hypothesis. But I think there's something to that for sure.
And I do think it's striking to think about how, so this is a country that had open internet access until recently, now that since the war began, much more censorship, but people are able to find the narratives that they want, or some narratives come their way and they believe them fervently and it's hard to change their minds. But we also know that from the American political context, right? That people will start to believe a certain narrative and it can be very difficult for them to change their minds, no matter how much other information you send their way. And a lot of Russian citizens now are not getting other information.
Can I jump in? Just the 2 quick points on the church and also on the public opinion, if I could. I actually I guess I would partly agree and partly disagree with Graeme. I think it's definitely the case that given the repressive political climate in Russia, we should take any opinion polls, with a grain of salt, and we ultimately, don't really know what the true opinions are. So I think this sort of polling data with 80+% support, certainly, that's probably not the number. On the other hand, I wouldn't agree. I mean, I'm not saying that Graeme was making that point in particular, but I don't think we can absolve Russian society from supporting this war. Right, for whatever reason, the people are either they're swayed by propaganda or they have some sort of defensive reaction or rally around the flag. I think we have multiple evidence from, people not believing their family members being bombed, right? People talking about, Ukrainians as being inferior and sort of deserving what they got, right? And I think that's important, both sort of, I think this boundary between Putin's war and Russian society war, like I personally do think Russian society, at least a part of it, carries responsibility and some part of the blame for this, right? And I think also importantly, this is how people feel in Ukraine. So this sort of thing that it's like it's on the Putin. I mean, Ukrainians who are being, raped, whose, houses are being trashed, Russian soldiers spreading excrement on the wall, like, how is that Putin's fault, right? So I think that's sort of, I guess I'm trying to say sort of both of these things are true, that, yes, opinion polls are, not maybe reliable. And again, attitudes do change. So the fact that before the war there was not much support, it doesn't mean that there isn't now. And again, it may change in the future. So sort of public opinion also has sort of temporal factor, right? And then on the church specifically, I mean, I agree with what Graeme said. I mean, the Russian church is essentially an extension of the Russian state. There is sort of called symphonia, right? Symphony between church and state. And the Russian patriarch, very unambiguously, not only also supports this war, I think also provides spiritual justification, because this whole narrative of Ruski Mir and how Ukraine is really part, of this sort of broader Russian world, and therefore Russia is right to reclaim it. I mean, that comes, that's yet another avenue of ideological justification. But what I would add to this, that it's sort of, again, in this ironic twist, how Putin creates unity in Ukraine where maybe before it didn't exist. I think we see that happening in Ukrainian Orthodox politics, because in Ukrainian Orthodox politics, there have been 2 competing Orthodox churches, one aligned with Moscow and one independent. And since the war started, the Moscow-aligned Orthodox Church in Moscow actually came out against Kirill's statement. They condemned, their leader condemned the war. They haven't gone as far as breaking their ties with the Russian church. That may, still happen. But certainly this sort of, undermining essentially Russian standing in Ukraine that they had through this Moscow-aligned church is another, I'm sure, unintended, but a consequence of this aggression.
Great, thank you. And we certainly have a lot of evidence of Russian citizens mobilizing for the war that don't have to, right? Like, I mean, we don't know how representative these are, but we have a lot of pictures of, young people in malls with the Z on their shirt, with their fist raised and things like that. So, we know that to some extent, this kind of pro-war mobilization is having some traction.
Sure, but all of the data shows that young people in Russia are very much against this war. Even in the opinion surveys that we're seeing now, there's an enormous age gradient. So according to the surveys, old people are very supportive, and then young people are very critical. And so even under these circumstances, young people in Russia seem to be much more horrified by this than their elders.
That's excellent. The youth will save us. We've been counting on that for some time. So there's a question down here from one of my former students, Kat. Speak up so we can hear you. Yeah. This is not my area of expertise, but my first sort of thought is that it certainly is powerful to continue to, try to persuade through the truth, right? Because we know we have the truth of what is happening, that there's an invasion of a independent liberal democracy that was just sitting there minding its own business. We know the war crimes that are being committed, the incredible civilian destruction. So these are facts. And I feel like it is important to continue to, confront whether governments or citizens in countries that have been slow to join for a variety of reasons. Anybody want to add anything to that? Maria, Oksana?
I didn't hear the question, so I don't know what the question was.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was whether, as we see the hesitancy on the part of citizens and governments in some places, such as China and elsewhere, to kind of India to sort of come on board with what the Ukrainians would call the anti-war coalition. Is it sort of a lost cause, or is it worth continuing to try to persuade and build this coalition? I'm thinking, for example, of Israel, which has moved in the last few days in terms of starting to begin to take positions against the war.
I think it's not a lost cause. I think what we need to do more of is actually right now, I think, have more information about how this war is consistent with a revival of Russia's imperial project here, and actually to draw a distinction. What I wanted to do, and that relates to the previous question too, was to sort of draw a distinction between disinformation, where simply completely fake facts are being peddled, and there is a lot of that, but also between sort of Russian media interpreting the situation on the ground through this imperial lens, and Russian society actually seeing this interpretation and identifying with it. Now, that's not really disinformation, right? It's just an alternative worldview in which Russia is entitled to control over Ukraine because it is part of its former empire, and it is indeed defending itself against encroachment from the West taking over and brainwashing the Ukrainian public and installing a puppet government. Now, that's not necessarily disinformation. What it is sort of interpreting the events of the last 15 years through the imperial lens. And I think it is important to think why Russian society is responding and embracing in some part. Again, we don't know exactly what part of it embraces this narrative, but there is no evidence that this narrative is alien and is necessarily peddled through disinformation mechanisms, but resonates with a certain part of Russian society. And what we want to know is sort of how did it evolve over time in the last 20, 30 years in Russian history that at this moment, this narrative resonates.
And I would also say a version of that narrative seems to have held sway with some portion of our international relations scholars in the United States as well. So I think I'll take this opportunity to ask a kind of follow-up question, maybe start with Oksana and then go to you, Graeme, and then Maria last, about what have we learned in terms of political scientists, comparative politics, international relations, our kind of ability to understand Russia, specifically a great power, and understand what's going on the ground. Maybe Oksana, I'll start with you. Where does political science stand?
Yeah, well, I think political science will have a lot of reckoning to do, in the future, how to, so analyze this. But I think one clear lesson, from this, that ideas matter, and arguably even sort of political culture, as much as the fuzzy that term is, right? And as much as sort of people have been trying to move away from it in political science, at least in this sort of broad sweep civilizational arguments. I think this is something we will have to wrestle with again, because trying to kind of see sort of rational choice and strategic, calculations. It's not to say that this doesn't explain many things, but if you are, as Maria said, dealing with people who have certain worldview, right? And that worldview does have very clear cultural and historical parallels, and that matters, right? And how do we analyze it with the tools that we have, right? Because our tools oftentimes in political science are sort of much more specific. We try to do like surveys, and we try to make these contained arguments, right? Like with many qualifications and so forth. But what we see now, what Russia is doing, this imperial ambition, it's not new, right? Like historians have written about it, we know about it. The warning about that East European countries, Baltic countries have been making about, what sort of Russia would do and why they wanted to join NATO to begin with, and were often dismissed as being some sort of Russophobic and so forth, paranoid narrative, is now getting proof in the current action, right? How do we study this? So I think this would be something for political scientists to wrestle with. There's certain, I think, explanations and paradigms that we have rejected in recent decades may need to be revisited. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I remember in the 1990s when the Baltic states were trying to get into NATO, and they would tell, American policymakers, we need to get into NATO because Russia is down now, but we're afraid of what it will do. And they would be told, no, don't say that. And if you wanted to get into NATO, just tell us how much you love America, but don't talk about a Russian threat, because we'll interpret that either as dangerous or that you're not really thinking straight. So what about you, Graeme? What do you think? Political science reckoning?
So, everybody has mistakes that they've made, and there's lots of them to find. So instead, I'm going to actually talk about two things that political scientists got right that I think are really important. One is those that studied civil society in Ukraine would have told you that this was going to be politically a disaster for Russia, and that Ukraine would be, even if conquerable militarily, right? That's apparently most military analysts thought that Ukraine was conquerable militarily, but they would be utterly ungovernable. And I think, that Ukraine has shown, and anyone who studied civil society in Ukraine would have told you that before the war began. The second thing that is sort of really interesting to me, personally, is I study authoritarianism, and I teach in my classes that authoritarian leaders tend to have authoritarian systems in general have really serious information problems, because you can't, without elections and without competitive media, it's really, really hard for you to understand what your society is like and how it's performing. And I always believe that, and I've taught it a million times, but man, is that true, I really underestimated how far someone like Putin could get from reality through the bubble of information bubble and the the yes men with whom he surrounds himself. And so that's sort of like really blown me away about how true that is and what the deep implications of that can be.
Maria, what would you like to add?
I would emphasize that one of the lessons international relations as a field needs to draw from this is that they cannot ignore domestic politics. It leads to making really bad predictions about what the outcome of stuff would be. And also for comparative politics, I think part of the lesson, I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily is a shock, but it reinforced, let's put it that way, reinforced the importance of field research and knowing things on the ground well. I mean, that's why the comparative politics people working on Ukraine knew immediately when this came out that Putin's plan is to go in quickly and install a puppet in Kiev. We all went, well, that may be the plan, but it's a crazy, stupid plan. And you don't know that unless you actually know things through an area studies lens, if we want to put it in that terminology, and you really know things on the ground.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that all the speakers have said. And I would just add, right, that a lot of the international relations security studies scholars and talking heads were having this kind of, calculating what is rational for Putin to do. And so, Putin will only take the Donbass. It's not rational for him to do anything else, without having ever studied either Putin or Ukraine, but just applying sort of general international relations theory to the situation. There's a spectacular version of this on my Facebook page on February 22nd, if you want to go see that, where one of our most esteemed colleagues essentially told me that I should stop worrying, sweet young Milada, because Putin would never do such a thing as invade Ukraine because it wouldn't be rational for him. But go ahead and say that he might, because that you're actually doing Putin's work by making him seem more important than he is, something like that. But a lot of that kind of applying black box IR theory to a situation didn't work out. Just like thinking that leverage in terms of energy, right? That Germany and other EU countries purchasing Russian energy meant that both sides were equally beholden to the other. We see today that actually Putin has much more power in that relationship than the West, at least at this particular moment, given those calculations that Western policymakers seem to be making about what their domestic constituencies are willing to bear in terms of costs. So that's a really interesting place where we are. All right, we are just about out of time. So I want to ask Oksana and Maria if you have any last thoughts that you want to share.
Yeah, could I actually briefly address a question from the chat, because there were some questions in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
So there was one asking about sort of if the Minsk Agreement could have been, a solution to, potentially prevent this war, and also, if Russia could really be defeated, because it was never defeated historically. So I just wanted to very briefly comment on that. On the Minsk Agreement, Maria and I actually wrote a piece about it before the war. What we have argued, and I would stand by this argument, I think from the very beginning, the Minsk Agreement, given that it was signed, in the conditions disadvantageous for Ukraine, and given how differently it was interpreted by Russia and Ukraine. So Ukraine really saw that as a way to, give some kind of very concrete concessions and accommodation for the Russian speakers in the Donbass region, things that sort of are very concrete, but the region itself would still be part of Ukraine, right? So they may have had slightly different sort of prosecution policy and linguistic policy applied, but the region would be essentially integrated back into Ukraine. And Russia always saw that as a tool to limit Ukrainian sovereignty. So that was essentially a different means to the same end. They basically interpreted this agreement with a so-called vaguely defined special status as such that would have given Russia control over Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy. So that would have essentially what Russia is now trying to achieve militarily is the exact same thing that it would have tried to achieve and failed through this Minsk Accord. So that's what I would say on the Minsk, right? And now on the defeat thing. So when I'm saying, when I was saying Russia needs to be defeated, and the question they're asking, right, but it was never defeated historically, I don't mean that Ukrainian troops march to Moscow and overthrow Putin, right? What I mean, by defeat is that Putin's objective in Ukraine, to essentially partition the country, if that would become his sort of scaled down objective, or controlling Ukrainian government. So that's the defeat on those lines, right? So basically, the occupation of Ukraine would be proven to be too costly militarily and otherwise that Putin would have to be forced to withdraw, right? Now, if he wanted to, he could still sell it as victory because essentially, Ukraine is not going to say go and take over, try to take Crimea over militarily. I would even say the parts of Donbass that were occupied before this invasion started in February, probably also some sort of compromise could be reached along those lines, because I don't think Ukrainian army would go roll into, that part of Donbass. So, and then it would be then up to Russian people decide, what they want to do domestically. They could become a North Korea under Putin, they could, potentially do something else. So this defeat kind of, as in like foreign army marching to Moscow and overthrowing Putin, like that's not what I was saying. I was saying more like objectives that Putin has in Ukraine, defeated in Ukraine, so Ukraine can regain, sovereignty and its territorial integrity, at least in the borders that, it had before the war started.
Maria, is there anything you would like to say in conclusion?
No, I'm good.
No,
I was
okay.
going to emphasize that Minsk Accords was a Trojan horse, so Oksana covered all that ground.
I think I'll end with a hard question for you, Graeme. So can you see a scenario where Putin accepts military defeat and brings the troops home out of Ukraine, at least out, not out of Crimea, but out of the areas that have been invaded since February 24th, and just retreats in a way with the goal of trying to lift some of the sanctions? Kind of a best case scenario, I suppose.
So I always answer questions like this by saying, fortunately, I don't live inside Vladimir Putin's head. And, I'm not his therapist either.
Isn't that why we pay you the big bucks, Graeme?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what Vladimir Putin wants or what he's going to do. But I do know that the relationship between reality and the narrative in Russia is tenuous at best. If it turns out that that's the narrative that he ends up having to sell, that, going back to Donbass and declaring victory, then it's possible that they'll try and do that. And it's possible they'll get away with it. But I very much hope that is the task that he ends up having to try and pull off.
So we'll end on that optimistic note. And I'll also tell you that I think just now, while we've been speaking, Pink Floyd has come out with a new song after some, 25 years of not producing any new music in support of Ukraine with Oksana. Do you know the name of this Ukrainian boombox star who's recorded the song with Pink Floyd?
No, I saw the brief message Maria sent earlier, but I haven't been able to listen to the song or even.
Yeah, his name is Andre something. Anyway, so that's come out while we've been here. So hopefully that will be raise lots of money for Ukraine and be another source of support from the international community. And I know from the friends I do have in Ukraine that all of these sort of signs of support do mean a lot to people there, seeing people protesting or rallying here in Chapel Hill, seeing the Metropolitan Opera start with the Ukrainian anthem. So some of these small signs I think are important. I want to thank all of you so much for coming, and thank you so much for all of your questions, and especially a big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could I just add, if you're looking for places to donate and support Ukraine, there's a list of them on the Center for Slavic Eurasian East European Studies website. Razom for Ukraine, Razom is the Ukrainian word for together, is a really great place to start. If you just Google that, they're providing a really good value for money in terms of your donation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Oksana.